the state of Michigan requires our barbers and cosmetologists to do more hours of training than medical doctors.
What?
That's the state law.
Holy wow. How much?
So barbers have to do 2,000 hours of training at a barber college. Cosmetologists are 1,800 hours. I don't know the discrepancy. And medical doctors are about 1,600 hours of undergrad and medical school.
Welcome back to the Talk Midland podcast. My name is Logan Richetti with Modern Realty. Today I have Jarrett Skorup, the Marketing and Communications Director for the Mackinac Center for Public Policy.
You got it. And nobody's ever gotten my name and our title of our organization right the first time. So good job.
Well, if there's anybody that would mess it up, it's me because I mess up every introduction. But hey, I nailed that one. So
there you go.
We're on for a good show today. I've been walking by the Mackinac Center for 15 years, and I've never walked in the door. I think a lot of people have no idea, or at least I have no idea what it was until recently. Can you tell us a little bit more about exactly what the Mackinac Center is?
Yeah, and some of that is we've been in Midland, headquartered in Midland, for almost the entirety of our more than 35 years. And so some of it's purposeful because we focus on state policy and some national policy issues. We don't do a lot with local public policy. And we are headquartered in Midland because a guy named Larry Reed was the chair of the economics department at Northwood. And he agreed to do this back in the late 1980s, but he said he wanted to be in Midland and not in Lansing. And the board at the time said, okay, it'd be nice to have kind of a group focused on state policy that's not in kind of this Lansing legislative lobbying bubble. But the easiest way of explaining what we do is we produce studies, videos, opinion articles. We have economists on staff, researchers on staff, and we write reports that make recommendations to state lawmakers around the budget and around a host of public policy issues.
Wow, that's a lot. There's a lot going on there, and I never realized exactly what they were doing. But our mutual friend Haley has begun working with the organization, so she's kind of filled me in a little bit on. It's an education component. There's a lobbying component. Is that accurate to say, or no?
Yeah, we have a Lansing office as well with a couple of people that work out of that and lobby legislators. And so we would say we're a free market think tank. We're more on the conservative side of the spectrum, though we don't touch any social issues. We focus pretty heavily on fiscal policy issues, economic issues. So our main areas are education policy, fiscal policy, which is like taxes and budget, and energy environment, environmental policy, criminal justice. And then we have a law firm that's attached to the think tank where we have 5 or 6 attorneys on staff. Mm-hmm. We file lawsuits on behalf of people, usually that are seeing oppressive government overreach in their staff. But if you think about, trying to explain policy. So you think about doing real estate, doing realtor. So there's a whole bunch of laws that the government has regarding real estate and getting a realtor license and who's required to have a license and the continuing education and all those things related to it. Most people out there probably work in an area where public policy affects them in some way. Our job is to say what's the right role for government to have and what are the things they do where it's too much and should be scaled back.
Where does that mandate come from? Do you have some kind of a vision or mission statement, or who decides which issues to tackle and what priorities to focus on?
Oh yeah, good question. So the only real kind of mandate vision statement side of it is we are going to advocate for lesser government, and most times what we would see as a fair government. But the policy people have their own kind of in terms of what are the areas they have expertise in, what are the things they want to focus on. They have expertise in the ability to do that. So the guy who's the head of our environmental policy is a guy named Jason Hayes. Jason was a backwoods ranger up in Canada. He cares a lot about forestry. So he will write reports on kind of how the state government can do a better job of managing forests. And you might think, well, who really cares? Why does it matter about forestry? Well, actually in the research, it matters a lot because whether the government manages forests, whether the federal government does it, state government does it, private interest does it, actually affects things like the amount of forest fires we get, actually affects things like can we get oil and natural gas from forests? Can we do logging? What are the rules around that? And somebody has to be out there writing information on this so that hopefully it results in a better economy for the state of Michigan.
And this organization is run through grants or donations, fundraising. It's got a pretty big budget?
Yeah, it's we're about a $10 million budget. It's a nonprofit think tank, so we raise all the money. It's all from private individuals, either foundations or individuals, and then some from businesses, but primarily directly from individuals and foundations. So thousands of people, but mostly around the state of Michigan.
And of course, every year, if I understand correctly, the state of Michigan has a budget process. Yeah.
So then one of the big things that we do every year is make recommendations to lawmakers when they're debating the budget for the actual state of Michigan. So the state of Michigan has about a $84 billion budget, manages everything from funding schools to Medicare or to Medicaid, so our healthcare system, roads, bridges, transportation, what the rules are for our energy system. So we write reports making recommendations along those lines. And we will do a lot of comparisons. So for example, Michigan has a much larger budget per person than the state of Indiana. And so then we ask questions like, well, how does Indiana have a better, more highly rated roads than Michigan does? What do they do for their school policy that we think we should replicate? What are things that Michigan should do that we think what do we think Michigan's doing that's better than the state of Indiana in terms of all those different policy issues? And we say this to lawmakers, and they have to debate and pass a budget. That's the one thing they have to do every year. So it's a prime time to get our ideas out there.
All right. So there's a lot going on there when you think about data analysis, reporting, and packaging of information to make it easy for lawmakers to understand and identify priorities, and also to sway public opinion and help public opinion to be more informed. For example, I never knew that the budget per capita in Michigan is higher than in Indiana.
Yeah.
And then of course I would have no reference to know what their roads ratings are versus ours, but that's where the Mackinac Center and other organizations like it put those pieces of information together in such a way that they can be analyzed and informed for decisions.
Yeah. And I mean, so the next closest state to Michigan's populations, our population's around 10 million people, is North Carolina. North Carolina, our budget's $83 billion. North Carolina is about $60 billion. So the question is, what do we spend our extra $20 billion on that North Carolina doesn't? And some things are, obvious or make sense, which is our roads just fall apart more quickly. We're a northern state than North Carolina, so maybe we have to spend more on roads. But on the other hand, we are spending a lot more per student here in the state of Michigan. We're spending way more on our road spending and still not getting the results that they are. We spend a lot more on our state employees per person. And so we would look at things like that and ask questions about, well, what are some things that Michigan is doing that we should get out of that is causing higher costs? We spend way more on our energy costs per person in the state of Indiana, even when you adjust for the cold winters that we have than they have there. So there's just a whole host of things that we do that we would call for that we should lessen spending on. And in North Carolina has lower taxes than we do. So they're able to fund a state government that does a lot of things just as well or better than we are with lower spending. And so we're the ones that are asking that question of what are the areas that we can actually cut government spending, return that money back to private citizens so they can spend on themselves, their businesses, their families.
All right. So is it safe to say that most of your communications are with Republicans, or is it across the board? How does it work?
Yeah, I mean, well, we're trying to persuade people of all political stripes. Republicans generally on fiscal issues, on some fiscal issues, are more likely to listen to us, but we do a lot of stuff that's very bipartisan. So one of the big issues that we've suggested over the decades is that Michigan spends billions of dollars every year on select subsidies for certain corporations and businesses. We have always opposed that. We've said you should have no special favors or subsidies for any specific business or industry. We should have low flat rates for everybody. Sometimes Republicans agree with that. Sometimes they don't. But the main bill we had on that, or the main support of zeroing that out to nothing, it was supported by the Mackinac Center. It was supported by the lone Democratic socialists in the state of Michigan. So he might want us to take that money and spend it on other things that we don't agree with. But on the one hand, we are in agreement on that. We have called for Michigan hands a monopoly for its energy production to two companies here in the state of Michigan. We have always said that we shouldn't do that. We should allow people to shop, get their energy, their electricity from any company that they want. Republicans and Democrats have usually opposed that. They've kind of both get a lot of campaign donations from those two energy companies, and it's been very hard to get something moving on that. We've called for a total school choice in the state of Michigan. So essentially the state of Michigan, they spend about, Logan, you've got kids in school, they take $10,000. Your daughter, if whatever school she goes to, that $10,000 will follow her in the public school system only. We've said they should be allowed to take that $10,000, like Indiana, like North Carolina, like Florida. That money should follow her kids to private school, to homeschooling, to any type of school choice that they want. The state of Detroit is the place in the state. They vote for all Democrats, yet that they exercise the most school choice here in the state of Michigan. So there are issues that we do have kind of across the partisan lens.
Well, an issue like that school choice and the voucher system, is that what it's called?
Yeah, tax credits or vouchers, yeah.
That's been a hot button issue in the last several years at a nationwide level. I remember hearing about that. And obviously, if I understand it correctly, the opposition to that concept is really the monopoly that the public school systems have with generating or collecting the vast majority of the revenue from the taxes from the states, right? They get the most of the budget.
Yep.
And so if they start losing kids, then the budget goes down, and that's the concern they have. Is that right?
Sure. Yeah. And I mean, nobody wants to lose out on customers. But the question in my mind is, if the state of Michigan said Midland gets one grocery store, and that's where you got to go for your grocery store, I think we all know here what would happen, which is that grocery store would probably cost a lot and probably not give very good service because they wouldn't have to respond to competition. I think if you were a realtor and you were the only realtor here in the state and you got to sell every house, you probably wouldn't work as hard and find as much value for your customers as you would in a system where there is a monopoly. So yeah, nobody wants to lose the monopoly status. There should be some clear rules that government should set, but a lot of other states do allow students to take the money wherever they want to go, and they tend to have a lot higher parental satisfaction and better educational results as well.
And part of that headwind is the teachers union. Is that correct? Because they lobby and they donate so much to candidates.
Yeah, so teachers unions tend to be one of the main oppositions for us at the Mackinac Center.
Sure.
So they, number one of the big issues we do is just that every person should be allowed to choose whether they want to join a union or not. And teachers unions have long advocated for, pushed for laws to require everyone that works within any type of unionized environment, they have to be a member, they have to pay full dues to the teachers union. So Michigan in 2012 became a right-to-work state, which we repealed that law last year, but essentially said wherever you work, you do get a choice in union membership, whether to pay any dues or not to the unions. We think that that's helpful, one, just on the freedom side. Nobody should be forced to join a private group against their will, and that's what state government was providing. But also it's just better. It makes the schools better. It makes unions better because they have to actually advocate and try to figure out what they need to do for their membership. But yeah, they tend to oppose right-to-work laws. They tend to oppose school choice laws. They want kids to be kind of put into the public school system, and they want the public school system to kind of regularly, continually get more money.
And that was repealed last year?
The right-to-work law, it's a little complicated. I won't go too in the weeds. So the law allowing people to choose whether or not to be members of a union or not was repealed last year. However, 5 years before that, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that all government employees are right to work across the country. So if you are a teacher in a public school system, you still do have the right to work regardless of what Michigan's law is. Essentially, it was a First Amendment violation. The First Amendment doesn't allow the government to force people to join political organizations. So there's a Supreme Court ruling on that. So anyone that works for a government entity does have the choice of whether to be a member of a union or not.
Well, they can still steer you into it. The Midland, the Board of Realtors, to be a member of the Association of Realtors and get into the MLS, you have to be in the board, and you have to. There's ways that they force you or they coerce you into having to conform into those kind of organizations, regardless of the laws, which I think is frustrating.
Yeah.
But that's
one of the areas of research that is more my specialty is occupational licensing laws. So I know a lot about licensing. My dad, my parents were teachers, but my dad was also worked in construction. So I've produced a couple of reports over the years where, Michigan requires a license for lots of jobs, including teachers and realtors, like we talked about. And so that does an analysis. It looks at when did those jobs become licensed? What are the economic effects of requiring an occupational license, both for competition and for safety? It compares Michigan to surrounding states. What are things that we license in different ways that other places don't? But not just like whether Michigan should have a license. Every state requires a teacher license. Almost all of them require a realtor license. But how easy is it to use that license? So what kind of continuing education do you have to do? If you're a teacher in another state, can you move into Michigan and get to be able to be a teacher right away or a realtor right away? Can you have an out-of-state license and still operate in the state? Those are pretty important issues too, because allowing people more freedom to get into an industry means more jobs in that industry, but it does affect also the wages of people who are working in that industry. So it's another area that we look at, and is a fairly bipartisan issue, kind of bipartisan support for change and bipartisan opposition to change.
All right, so the Michigan Association of Realtors is that a lobbying organization or just some kind of a member organization? Do you deal with organizations like that indirectly to provide them with information and ideas as well?
Yeah, directly and indirectly. So it's an association. It's they do lobbying, and they also oversee like continuing education rules. There's a lot of associations like that in Lansing. Sometimes we're in agreement, sometimes we're in disagreement. So we have been in agreement. One of the areas that we've looked at is like zoning rules across the state of Michigan. So over the, housing has gone up. The price of housing has gone up quite a lot. There's a limited amount that state lawmakers can do on things like bringing down the price of materials. But there are things they can do in terms of increasing the labor force, so the number of people that can actually work on housing. That relates to licensing laws. It relates to encouraging more people to go into CTE programs in high school. So we do make recommendations to just get government obstacles out of the way for people who want to do that. But then there are direct things that the government puts in place. Zoning rules, permitting rules. Michigan takes way longer to approve housing than it used to. If you go back to the 1980s, it takes way longer to get an apartment approved, a house approved nowadays. There's a lot more licensing restrictions. There are mandates on businesses. There are new regulations on housing, some of which make sense, some of that don't in terms of what you have to add to new builds. There are cities now that are trying to require sprinkler systems on every new house. That you can't do natural gas on new houses. There are things that raise the price of housing. And then just zoning rules. Most of the city of Midland, it is illegal to build multifamily housing in. We do have a lot of multifamily housing across the city, but that was built prior to zoning rules going in and restricting that. And if you restrict most of your city, as most cities in Michigan do, and say, nope, you can only have a single family home here rather than something for 2 families or 3 families or 4 families. Well, I work in economics. You have lower supply. When you have higher demand, that means prices go up. And so one of the big reasons housing has spiked is all these mandates done at the state and local level that has driven costs up. And so we produce a report laying that out for lawmakers, looking at what other states have done to encourage housing. And a lot of other states and cities have seen rental costs go down, while Michigan has continued to go up because of reforms that they did. And so that's another example of an area that we work on. Fairly bipartisan area so far, but not one that lawmakers have taken up quite yet.
So the idea being, why is the state necessarily involved in local zoning ordinances and restrictions anyway? Oh,
great question. So most zoning arose at the local level, independent of the state. States have the ability to choose what they allow in terms of zoning. And one of the things that, if you go way back, go back decades, the reason the state first got involved on that issue was local cities, especially outside of Detroit, were putting in place zoning rules to prevent Black people from moving into the suburbs or low-income people from moving into their communities. And so, partially as a result of federal court decisions, the state had to get involved to loosen up some of these zoning rules that were directly discriminatory.
Those were redlining?
They were redlining, but also more like, I would call gray lining, where they weren't specifically based on race, but in reality, they were based on race. They were intended to have homes that were larger, single-family homes, and to prevent apartments because they knew lower income people were going to move in. And so the state did get involved decades ago in some ways. Now, nowadays, I don't think that those are getting put in place directly because people, are doing it for racial reasons, but they are doing it for economic reasons. It is very clear people want to block lower income residents from moving into different parts of their city. And, from my perspective, like, I'm a free market guy. I believe in personal property rights. And I think that if somebody owns a lot and they want to make it a fourplex versus a single family home, they should be allowed to do it. And then I also think just from the practical perspective, we don't want zoning rules that over the decades led to slums in a lot of our cities, because when you blocked people from building everywhere across the city, it forced the concentration of people in poverty living in some areas. And if you go to New York and you go to San Francisco, a lot of the slum creation over the decades were because of zoning rules that got the result that we were seeing there. And it didn't help. It drove up housing costs for everybody else. So what we want is, we kind of want, I think, a spread out where everybody can live in the community of choice. I think there should be limits to what you can prevent your neighbor from doing with their own property. But at the end of the day, I do think we should loosen zoning laws, but more importantly, we also just need to make it easier to build. We need to fast track permitting, and these same structures that are built the same way in many cities, they don't need to go through this very strict permitting process that takes years and years and years to go through. That's how you're getting higher costs, and that's how you're having worse effects for everybody, regardless of where you are income-wise.
If the Mackinac Center could initiate one statewide change with a snap of a finger, what would it be?
Great question. It would either be total energy, electricity choice, or it would be total school choice, because those are the biggest parts of spending. So the energy, electricity, that is a huge area of spending for every business and individual in the state of Michigan. And by having so right now we have the highest energy costs in the Midwest. We used to have the lowest energy costs. People don't realize this. Back in 2000, when we had full electricity choice, we had the lowest electricity costs in the Midwest. We've gone lowest to highest. It's a huge part of our income, and not just for individuals, but for any business that wants to open. And so when businesses are looking at where they want to locate, energy is a big deal. And it's just ludicrous that the state of Michigan says, in Michigan, you either have to use consumers' energy or DTE. That's it. You don't get any choice outside of that. So I think that would be a big one. And then the other would, go ahead.
How does that work? How does the money flow? Does consumers pay high taxes from the revenue they get to the state, or are they exempt from taxes, or do they pay? How does it work?
They get a monopoly on a service area of the state. So they anyone that lives in that service area, business or individual, with a couple of very minor exceptions. Now, Dow Chemical being one of those exceptions, where you have the co-op in town. So there are agreements like that have existed through the past that have survived kind of that monopoly system. But essentially what happens is they control the whole system. So everybody here in the town of Midland, you have to use consumers' energy. Now, consumers has to go to the state and they propose rate hikes. They never propose rate reductions, you'll notice, but they propose rate hikes, and there is a board that oversees that, and they make a case for why they need more money. But if you look at the board that approves this, which are appointed by the governor and some lawmakers, they tend to be executives of these energy companies. And Michigan has laws like that for medicine, for hospitals, for energy, and they're all very anti-competition. And there are lots of other states that do it where it's a lot more of a competitive structure. The rates are better and people are more satisfied with what they get.
What would the other side of the table, how would they advocate for this monopoly being more efficient? What would they say?
They would say that in order for us to make big investments where you're talking about decades down the line, so consumers is buying their natural gas from other companies, coal, wind, solar, that you need this stable structure to make those investments, and for them to make billions and billions of dollars of investments, they have to have a stable number of customers they can count on, or else they're less likely to make those investments. So that's my fairest way of summarizing what they would say. And then my answer to that would be lots of other states don't have that. They do have multiple big companies that are competing over people. and they're still making those investments decades down the line. And then I just like, for grid stability. So we have this grid where you're relying on when we have bad weather, we're connected to this grid that's supposed to kick in to help people. If we lose power here in Midland, how do we get it back on much more quickly? But I think that this monopoly power that we've had has driven grid instability rather than made it better. And they would argue that they do a better job of stabilizing the grid than a bunch of people in the competitive space.
All right, let's talk about school choice at a statewide level.
Yeah.
How would that change occur, and what would the effect of that change look like were it to occur?
So the way our ideal, kind of system would be a tax credit or voucher system where the state of Michigan, right now the way it works is most of the school money comes in through the sales tax, and then the state gives it out to all the school districts on a per student basis. So if you're a public school, traditional public school or charter school, the number of students you get, that's the bulk of your funding that you get, at least from the state. On top of that, local school districts can raise money locally. They can have a bond or a millage, and they can raise money for their buildings, not for employees, but to build buildings and facilities locally. So our system, which is not crazy, it's done in about half of other states at this point. It's done fully in 15 other states. Is the state takes that money they have, whatever it is. In Michigan, it's about $10,000 per student. Other states, it's $8,000, $7,000. And they let you take it to whatever school district you want. So I have 4 children. 2 of them are at Seabird Elementary. One's at Jefferson Middle School. The other's too young for school. But we could either take that $10,000 right now. They take that $10,000. And my 2 daughters, they go to Seabird. My son goes to Jefferson. They get that $10,000 for those kids. If I wanted to take them to Calvary Baptist, if I wanted to take them to a high school in Saginaw or Bay City that's a private school, the money would follow them there. Or if I wanted to homeschool them, a set amount of that money would be able to use for homeschooling, or more popularly for a variety of services. So maybe my son who's in 6th grade, he can do a math class at Dow. If he's advanced in math, he can do some sports at Jefferson. He can do his religious classes or something at a religious school. Whatever. Like, there's increasingly ways that people split up that state funding nowadays. And we just think they should be able to do that, whatever the operator, public, private, nonprofit, for-profit, however they want to go. And lots of other states do that. But right now that is against state law in Michigan. And it's actually unconstitutional. Our constitution in the state of Michigan prevents that. So that would be a long-term hope that we have to replicate other states that are doing that. And those states saw a lot of growth during COVID, when you kind of did see where schools responded different ways to how they were open and what services they offered.
All right. So the sales tax from commerce in the state of Michigan flows into the state treasury, state budget. Then it deploys down into the school districts on a pro rata basis based on the number of kids they have.
You got it.
No, are there any other factors that influence the distribution of that money, or is it just strictly based on school attendance?
There are other monies that come from the state that are on other factors, and a lot from the federal government that are based on special education, poverty level, things like that, free lunch programs. So that is kind of the core of that funding, follows people. And then on top of that, if you have a low-income student, if they're in an impoverished district, if they're, then they would, if they're special needs, then they would get extra money on top of that. So even Flint Public Schools gets way more money per student than Midland. Saginaw gets way more money than Midland does, because they have a higher percentage of students that are in poverty and a higher percentage that are special needs. So there are a couple other factors besides that, but that's the bulk of it.
So the state funding handles employee salaries and compensation. Is that right? Teacher salaries?
That state funding just goes for whatever districts want to use it for.
So the superintendent gets a group of money, and then he or she distributes it or budgets it?
But the 80%, 85% of school funding is employee costs. So yeah, the vast majority is going to go to that.
Okay, and the big millage vote going on in Midland here about a bond for additional school development, that is outside of this budget. That is a special assessment.
Locally, schools can then do their own special assessment, but it can only fund buildings. So There are different states do different things, but in the state of Michigan, your local tax dollars can only go to the traditional public school district, not to private schools, not to charter schools, and can only be used for building or operating costs.
How would the Mackinac Center view a proposal like that? Would they be in favor of that? Or would they be opposed to it? Or how would they decide?
Yeah, I've gotten asked that, especially people around Midland. And so the main way that we're never going to come out and say, vote yes or vote no on any proposal.
Interesting.
We're just a nonprofit, so we don't take direct political, and we wouldn't say support this candidate or this candidate. But usually for any time, in Midland and around the state, people will have these millage votes, these tax increases. And most of the time, we're just helping people navigate the information they want. So how much has school spending gone up or down in your area? How does Midland compare on its spending compared to other communities in the area or that they're competitive with? Are we spending more on administrative costs than other places or less? How has our test scores been doing? Are we improving? Are we doing worse? What's the overall budget look like? So most of the time, that's kind of what we're providing, just helping people navigate that state data. And we run a couple of databases on our website too that tracks like employee salaries and school performance.
Okay, so speaking of data and information, if somebody wants to learn more about one of these issues, where would you direct them?
Depends on the issue. So we have a lot at our website, mackinac.org. But the state of Michigan has a lot of information it puts out there on all these different things. So even something like, on university spending. So how much do we spend on our universities? Hint, we spend widely different amounts, and it doesn't really follow a rhyme or reason. And so we help people navigate that, like pull the information out of the budget, try to get it to people. So a lot of the data we're providing is what you might imagine and probably what you do in the realtor space of pulling out this complicated information, putting it into a graphic form that people get, doing short articles on it, and trying to put it from that perspective.
What would be one thing that would blow me away that you guys have uncovered with data?
One thing that would blow you away, the licensing point. The state of Michigan requires our barbers and cosmetologists to do more hours of training than medical doctors.
What?
That's the state law.
Holy wow. How much?
So barbers have to do 2,000 hours of training at a barber college. Cosmetologists are 1,800 hours. I don't know the discrepancy. And medical doctors are about 1,600 hours of undergrad and medical school. So that one always blows me away.
What else? That's a wild one. What's another one like that?
That the total per student spending in Michigan is about $250,000 per classroom. So if you think of a typical teacher in their classroom, they've got 20, 25 students. That's $250 to $300, depending on the district, $250 to $300,000 sitting in that classroom they're looking at. And the teachers, they kind of know what their salary is and what their benefits cost. So then the question is, where's kind of the rest of that money going? And basically what's happened in the state of Michigan is teacher salaries have kind of run with the rate of inflation, maybe even a little, definitely behind the last couple of years, but the cost of benefits has gone up so much. So Michigan has about $40 billion in pension debt that we pay off. So almost all the increases in education spending the last decade have gone to help try to control the debt that we owe from employees who are retired decades ago. So we've mismanaged our education spending and our pension systems here in Michigan. And so people sometimes have a feeling of, I feel like I'm spending a lot more and I'm not getting better results. That's one of the reasons.
25 kids in a classroom, 10,000 per kid, 250,000.
Yeah, and it's actually 15,000 per kid is the average statewide. 15,000 per student.
Okay, so it's even more.
Yeah.
400-ish.
Yep.
Yeah, one teacher, two teachers in that range probably?
Yeah, so the average teacher oversees 22 kids.
Okay.
If you look at obviously there are classrooms with bigger, but if you add in the extra teachers, yeah.
All right, so there are some costs. I'm doing the math in my head trying to figure this out because it's a little wild. 250 to 400,000 per classroom for a 25 unit classroom, one teacher salary, teacher benefits, teacher retirement pension, also books, I don't know, other stuff.
Yep.
Lights,
administration. Yep.
Yeah. Things that, and please don't think I'm not saying there's a lot going on. I know there is. You got to buy books, you got to buy supplies. There are materials and things that go into teaching. But are you saying that a big portion of that budget is just going to pay for pensions for teachers who have retired 20 years ago?
40% of it. 40% of those dollars are going to pay pension debt of past employees.
Wow.
So that is when it's not so simple of a superintendent saying, hey, I have a new job opening and maybe, the incoming teachers in Midland, new teachers make 40, 42, 44,000. Great. We'll just hire them now. They got to think about that. They spend about $20,000 on healthcare insurance, which is very expensive for the employee. Then they have to set aside the pension for that teacher. And then the state says, here's this new massive amount we also have to spend on pension debt that we're trying to get a hold of. And so it's a little trick. They send the money to the districts and then they pull it right back to help spend that money. And so that to me is interesting because pension debt getting out of control is not really a partisan issue, but trying to get a hold of it is no one's heard of this issue. It's very minor, but they should probably know that 40% of our payroll costs go to pension debt of past employees. And that suggests pretty big mismanagement by lawmakers over the decades. And it has been big mismanagement over the people overseeing the pension system and lawmakers.
What did they do wrong?
They made that the shortest answer is they make short-term decisions for long-term problems. Lawmakers care, number one, about getting elected, number two, about getting reelected, and everything else 10 and 20 years down the line, harder for them to think about and care about. And so what they did was, as the state had budget crises, our state can't technically go into debt. Like the budget has to be whatever money they bring in, but one way they can get around it is they can change the assumptions on that system. So they assumed higher rates of investment returns than we actually got. They assumed teachers or employees were going to live shorter lives than they actually lived. And then they assumed a growing amount of payroll over the decades. Michigan's had stagnant population, yet they continued to assume growing payroll because growing payroll would mean fewer amount per person that you had to put in. All of those things were wrong. They did it for many decades, and that's driven us to this crisis that we have now. Now, we're not the worst state. We're pretty bad. My home state of Illinois is the worst state. Hundreds of billions in pension debt. They have a massive problem, and then what happens when you do that is the credit ratings, the national credit ratings, downgrade you, and so then trying to borrow money to do things like fix your roads or to build new buildings, your rates are not as good as they could be. So this affects here in Midland because when we're bonding out this bond that we're talking about voting on for our school buildings, our rates are worse than they could be because the state has all this pension debt that are coming from public school districts.
This is a similar concept to the Social Security on a nationwide level.
Pretty similar. The only difference is that by law and by Constitution, state lawmakers are supposed to be properly setting aside the right amount of money. Congress can do what it wants. Like there's not really limits on it. They can borrow money. They have borrowed a lot of money. States aren't supposed to be able to do that. So the only thing I'd say is it's even worse because we have more limits on state lawmakers and they've still just done the best they can to ignore what those limits are. And it's hard work. We have to convince lawmakers now that are getting elected to try to solve a problem when they are out of office. And that's difficult.
Yeah, because nobody wants to go campaign and say, hey, I'm going to cut everything to help the budget go from 40 billion, the budget deficit from 40 billion, whatever, to 30 billion, the pension, whatever.
Yep.
Yeah, that's not exciting. And we're seeing some of that now.
And I have to take money from services and taxpayers today in order to do that. So we have been lucky. We have gotten our last governor, Rick Snyder. He was a finance guy, so he at least did some pretty major stuff on this to help it, even though it didn't help him politically. And there has been some lawmakers, even in a bipartisan manner, willing to do that. There's a lawmaker. Tom Leonard, who is in Michigan, and he had worked out of the state budget office. So they managed the pension system of the state employees. So he just, as a finance guy, was always worried about it. So when he got elected as a state lawmaker, he came in and really cared about that. So there are some people like that really do care. I mean, it's not just a state level. City of Midland has millions and millions, tens of millions of dollars in pension debt. And our city manager, our last city manager said that to me, that's the thing that keeps him up the most at night, because we are going to see increasing amounts, and we have seen increasing percentage of our city budget go to pay down pension debt of people who are already retired now, and that's just not a good way to run a city.
Well, how do you fix it, Mayor? If you were going to be the mayor someday, what would you do?
Every dollar above what's absolutely necessary to provide services would go to pay down that debt. So we should talk about no new increases in flashy try to get that money out of the foundations, which they've done a good job of doing, but go to your public employees and say, look, we're going to give you raises at the rate of inflation, but until we get a handle on this pension debt and get it back to a more manageable level, like you only pay out what you actually need to attract employees in the city. Everything above that, you just have to get it back to where you're paying down that debt in order to save the pensions of the people who are working right now and the people off in the future. There have been a spike in municipal bankruptcies the last 10 years around the country. You don't want to do that. That means a massive haircut for everybody. Midland's not, we're not as bad, obviously, as a lot of other cities, but we still have only set aside about 60 cents of every dollar that we do need to pay off in the future. So we do need to make smart long-term decisions, small ones now that do a little pain now rather than big pain later.
Yeah, that's been a constant concept for the last 10 years or so, and it's tough. It's a tough debate to win on both sides, especially if you're a politician, because it's just so much easier to not worry about it, kick the can, as opposed to trying to convince everybody that financial austerity measures need to be taken to certain extents, right?
Well, and it's tough for unions because they're bargaining this. So the city's bargaining this. They have to bargain in good faith, but you need some smart long-term union leadership also to say, okay, we do need to have a give and take here. But I think everyone should just care about that, because every dollar we have to spend on pension debt is one less dollar we have for our parks, for our roads, for all the things that we do care about locally. If you go to Oakland County has no pension debt. They never adopted pensions for their public employees. They have a very generous 12% 401k match. So they do provide a pretty generous, very generous for the private sector. But they have, even with Democrats now in charge of Oakland County, they've had Republicans and Democrats. They have never gone in on pensions. They've just said, we're going to do a very generous match. And then that way we can't actually add any long-term liabilities onto our employees. And Oakland County's been a very fast-growing county. They've been able to provide a lot for parks, a lot for services, a lot of spending on things now that other cities aren't able to do because of this debt.
So why, if I ran my real estate brokerage like that, it would eventually go out of business. Why do cities and states and the federal government run at such deficits?
I mean, the reason is that a city government and state government and federal government is going to be around much longer than any business. So the actual are we going to be around 100 years and still paying for these pensions? The answer is yes, almost for sure yes. Versus a private sector side, which is overseen by these fiduciaries, would say, look, you're not putting in near the requirements on what you would have to put in to run a system like that are a lot higher, even for a company like Dow Chemical. And people, they talk about the pension going away at Dow and some of these large companies. But, the people overseeing that are saying these companies have to be around here. If I'm getting a pension for them, I'm starting right now at Dow at 22 years old. They still got to be around when I'm 80. And the chance of that is way less than working for a city. But the incentives are also worse on the public sector side, because it's just way easier to promise lots of pay and benefits as much as you can. Because especially when you have this system of, you can promise the union, we'll give you a good pension, we'll give you good benefits. The union can then help fund and advocate for you to get elected locally. You have this kind of cycle that I think is inappropriate, and it has led to a lot of bad systems. But occasionally we do get some pretty good, long-thinking people. I do think Midland is well managed as a city and for what it has gone through, but that is the one main issue for me that I think that they should continue to look at and spend more time on.
Well, before we go, let's take this to the national level and help me understand this tariff situation that's going on right now. I think I understand it, but I'm sure you have a better grasp. My understanding is that the tariffs that are being charged to other countries are to try to balance the trade deficit between how much we send out in goods and services versus how much we take in and how much they charge us. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's it in theory, and I don't think it makes any sense in practice, or really too much in theory.
Interesting.
So we would see tariffs as that's the government charging extra on goods, and that is almost always a bad idea. And so of course, they feel better about it being on companies that are making products overseas. However, trade is very interconnected. Most people that make products in the United States, they are reliant on some products in other countries in order to make the products that they sell here. And then on the actual deficit part, so there's this theory that has been, which used to be very much on the left side of the political spectrum, is now increasingly moved maybe more towards the right side, certainly for the Trump administration, of that countries should only trade if it's like a 1-to-1. And that really, for economists, that doesn't really make sense. Like, just because you buy more from someone else than you sell them does not mean you're at a detriment. And on a local level, or individual level, that makes sense. Aldi gets a lot more. I get a lot more goods from Aldi than they get from me. They get my dollars. I get the goods. It doesn't mean I'm worse off. I would say I think I'm better off because obviously I value the goods more than the dollars. They value the dollars more than goods. That's how trade works. And it also works that way internationally. So I think what we would say is that tariffs are almost always a bad idea. We've done a lot of research on that, a lot of studies on that. We're in agreement. They're not a good idea. They maybe can make sense when you're in a war with somebody, if you actually have a real enemy on something along those lines, but it tends not to make sense, especially on neighbors like Canada and Mexico, where we rely a lot on their goods and we sell to them a lot. So I think tariffs are a bad idea. It raises goods on consumers, and it's not a good short-term or long-term strategy for our nation.
Well, clearly they're being used as a negotiation tactic. What are the elements at play? What is, in other words, what is the president trying to achieve?
That's the million-dollar question to me. So I hope what he's trying to achieve would be saying, okay, well, other countries have tariffs on our goods. We have tariffs on their goods. Let's figure this out and negotiate to a fair standard. And to me, a fair standard would be that nobody has tariffs on anyone's goods. And we kind of let the market sort out what we produce and what other countries produce and what we buy and what we sell. But the president coming out talking about, well, we have a deficit with another country, we have to try to rectify that. That is going to lead almost for sure to us hiking tariffs, them hiking tariffs, us hiking tariffs, them hiking. And that is the quickest way to a massive recession or what helped lead to the Great Depression 100 years ago. So I hope we don't go down that path and we get to more where it is something what he did talk about a little bit on the campaign trail of we should just kind of lower tariffs on everybody. And if the negotiation leads to that, then I'd be happy, but I'm not super hopeful yet.
Well, so the idea is that another country has a tariff on goods that we send to them in excess of what we charge in tariffs. So he's trying to increase the tariffs that we're charging the other countries to leverage them to lower theirs. And then he would theoretically lower his back down. And then we would have in theory, then we would have a better trade deal with that country as a result of the short-term bargaining.
Correct.
Okay. And there's a lot of...
But I do think I think President Trump has advisors who agree with that. And I think he has advisors who just are anti-trade. Just think trade is not a good thing. We should try to produce everything we can in the United States. And we are able to do that more than other countries in the United States. But I'm not aware of any theory that doesn't show that leading to a lot of short-term pain. And most theories that I would agree with think that long-term is also not going to be super helpful for a country.
So that concept would be that some of those perspectives are that we just need to make more here and purchase and consume less from other countries. And so any policy that encourages that is a good thing.
I think that is what the Trump administration would say. It's not one I really agree with. I mean, we do need to make more things here, but it's not all manufacturing. We also have a very knowledge-based economy. So just because I work in something or you work on something, we're not directly making a product. We are still doing something that is valuable to the economy. And that there are a lot of sales jobs that are like that. There are a lot of engineering jobs that are like that. And those are valuable to the economy as well as making things. And the United States is making more than we are making more today than we ever have before, ever, like by a significant amount. What I think people get confused is we are making more things with less people. And that worries a lot of people who, especially if they grew up in manufacturing. But from the economic perspective, we do want to make more goods, more agricultural, more food with less effort if we can. That's what helps make us wealthy and hopefully leads to better jobs in other industries.
Does the Mackinac Center, would it be their position that more domestic manufacturing and production is encouraged, or is it simply about efficiency?
I think that we would say a freer market where the government is not trying to pick and choose what taxes to have on different individual products or trying to create, quote unquote, create certain industries will lead to better long-term growth for us. More jobs, lower prices on goods, and efficiency is basically doing more with less, and that is an overall net economic good. And we have lots of job openings right now for people that want to work with them, even in things that do manufacture. So the construction industry is always looking for people out there. That is, to me, that's manufacturing. You're manufacturing goods. And if people want to work those jobs, they should. And if they want to work service jobs, they should. So at the end of the day, ours is the government should not be trying to pick what sector is best. The market figures that out, and that leads to long-term economic growth in a way that I wouldn't be able to tell you whether an agricultural job, manufacturing job, or service job is the best. I think people can choose that on their own.
If somebody wanted to make a donation or get involved with the Mackinac Center, where would they go?
www.mackinac.org, or come down 140 West Main Street. You can ask for me. I'll show you around the building. Anybody that lives locally in Midland and wants to learn more about what we do.
Jarrett Skorup, thank you for being on the Talk Midland podcast.
Thanks for having me.